too good for children to sit on. Ma had taken exception to her speaking to Emily like that, and they'd had words, which was perhaps why the invitation for tea hadn't been repeated. Emily had thought how smart Miss Concini was, with her long dark hair swept high on her head and fastened with shiny combs. Her ankle-length dress was a pale silvery grey and made of much better stuff than Ma's Sunday-going-to-church dress. Her shoes were black and shiny, with shaped heels, and she wore a huge sparkly ring on the third finger of her right hand. Emily thought it looked pretty, and on the train taking them home later that night, she'd asked her mother what kind of ring it was. Ma had sniffed and said it was a diamond, and then she'd muttered something strange. "She's no better than she ought to be, and he might think he's fooling us by calling her his housekeeper, but we all know the truth." When Emily asked Ma what she meant, she shook her head and looked angry. She refused to answer even when Emily repeated her question, so she'd given up asking. It was just one of those things people thought a 9-year-old child shouldn't ask. Emily was 10 now, and she still didn't know why Miss Concini was no better than she ought to be. The tallyman had started banging on the door and shouting at them. Emily put her hands over her ears to shut out the words, which she knew were abusive. Mr. Thompson always started out by being polite, but then he ended by yelling and swearing. Emily didn't know what all the words meant, but she knew they were rude. She was trembling and feeling sick, but she hunched her knees to her chest and kept as still as she could. If he saw the cloth move, he would guess she was under the table, and then he would just keep on and on banging. She forced herself to think of other things. Emily liked being 10. She was 10 years old and the year was 1907, so she'd been born in the 6th month of the year 1897. The figures had a sort of ring to them, and she was good at sums. She could add up in her head faster than Pa could with a bit of paper and a pencil. It was early October now, and she ought to be at school, but her mother often kept her at home to help her, because she said she was having another baby. Emily had noticed she was getting fatter, but she wasn't quite sure what having a baby meant. The vicar who ran the church school charged the families of the people who could afford to pay, but took poor children for free. There was a school in Ely that was entirely free, and all children under the age of 13 were supposed to attend, but it was nearly 4 miles to walk, and the bus fare to get Emily there every day would have been too expensive. Because Pa had a small holding, he was supposed to pay 3 pennies a week for her to attend the vicar's school, but sometimes he didn't have enough money. If Emily didn't attend, her father didn't have to pay the 3 pennies. So when money was tight, Emily stayed home to help her mother. She wasn't the only child to be kept off school to help out at home or in the fields, but most of her friends didn't care. They would rather be at work earning a few pennies than at school. Emily hated it when she had to miss school. She liked the vicar's house, which was almost as big as Uncle Albert's. He had a lovely parlour with green brocade curtains at the windows. His furniture was shabby and old, but it was comfortable, and Emily was sometimes invited for tea after school. The vicar's wife was a plump, friendly lady who had 3 sons but no daughters, and she always made a fuss of Emily. Emily often wished she could live in a house like Mrs. Potter's, but of course she always had to go home to her father's cottage. She wouldn't have minded that so much if her parents hadn't quarrelled most of the time. Emily didn't remember it happening so often when she was small, but of late they always seemed to be at each other's throats, and it was always over money. Joe Carter wasn't much of a farmer, so Ma said, and she let him know he was a failure in her eyes. Stella Black had come from better things. She was the daughter of a fen farmer. His land was in Chatteris, and according to Ma, much more fertile than the few acres Pa had inherited from his father. Pa's small holding was situated between the village of Witchford and Ely, a small market town with the status of a city, and famous for its wonderful cathedral and rich history. At the vicar's school they learned about Oliver Cromwell, who had cut off King Charles's head in the name of democracy, and then become a sort of king himself.
He allowed his men to destroy beautiful stonework in the cathedral,
the Reverend Potter told them in accents of utter disgust.
The cathedral was begun in the time of St. Ethelreda, and is one of the finest of its period. Cromwell was a bigoted man, and though he may have been just in many ways,